bad things well said.
Welcome back to your Monday morning misery. It is the beginning of the work week, and we are starting you off with a fresh, comprehensive menu of failure.
Good morning, and if you thought the weekend was any kind of escape, allow us to confirm that no, it wasn't. We've just had more time to marinate in the dread.
You know, the news cycle, dear listener, never rests. It just churns out new, and I have to say, increasingly inventive ways for us to feel profoundly, almost spiritually, let down.
I think we've scraped the bottom of the emotional barrel this week. If you thought Iceland was just, muddling through before, this week proves we've finally achieved a kind of national bankruptcy, moral, biological, and political.
Absolutely. We should probably state the show title right up front, just to set the deeply cynical mood.
Let's get it out of the way.
This is Bad Things Well Said Icelandic Newsroom. And our theme for the day, the single depressing narrative that links every single broken promise and flying trampoline from the last 7 days, is what we're calling the Great Withdrawal.
It's more than just a retraction. It's a panicked retreat on every single front. We are seeing Iceland pull back from any claim of true international morality, from competent leadership, from basic social welfare.
And even winter itself is withdrawing. The climate is refusing to cooperate with the glossy national marketing image we try so hard to sell abroad.
Exactly. The facade hasn't just cracked, it's sliding irreversibly into a wet, gray slush. And we are here to provide the unflinching, highly sarcastic analysis.
Okay, so let's unpack this with some quick hooks, just to keep you committed to this deep sense of impending doom.
Please proceed with the mandatory sarcasm.
First up, in the world of culture and, I guess, international relations, Ríkisútvarpið, our national broadcaster, RÚV, decided we are far too morally superior to sing pop songs in Vienna.
A noble stand.
But tell me, are we too moral to plan massive multi-million kroner trade delegations to Beijing?
Apparently not. No, the selective outrage meter is currently pegged. It's spinning wildly.
Next, we have to cover the greatest import scandal of the modern age. A horror story that hits us right in the genetics.
Oh, this one's a classic. We somehow managed to import a crippling genetic defect in a container optimistically marked Danish fatherhood.
We are, of course, talking about the Kjeld Scandal, a story where Iceland's deepest societal fear of, unknown kinship crashes headlong into the nightmare of globalized commerce.
Then there's the welfare segment, which is the real heartbreaker of the week. It confirms that our priorities are, entirely warped.
The government, having just located several billion kroner for its own lavish office renovations, suddenly couldn't keep a crucial food bank's Yelp's delivery truck running.
So poverty in the alleged land of welfare brought to you this Christmas season by corporate soda. The irony is just so thick you could carve it.
And finally, the weather. Proving to be the universe's ultimate fact-checker, it's just refusing to abide by our tourist pamphlets.
Meteorologist Siggy Stormer has decisively confirmed the forecast of the Red Christmas.
Meaning, the climate is finally refusing to provide the essential snow cover we need for our cozy national marketing image.
Just wet rock and bad vibes.
So that's our mission for the next 40 minutes or so, to make sure you start your Monday knowing exactly how many ways cultural, biological, financial, and meteorological things are falling apart all at once.
It really makes you wonder why anyone would choose to consume this information voluntarily. It defies rational behavior.
Right. Why inflict this comprehensive despair upon yourself? So here's our reverse psychology call to action, dear listener.
I'm ready.
Seriously, don't subscribe. Don't you dare tell your friends about this show. It might actually make you think critically about the state of affairs. And nobody wants that kind of responsibility, especially not on a Monday.
Let's begin the comprehensive breakdown. We start with the performative ethics of the cultural sector. The cultural withdrawal led by RAF.
Okay, let's unpack this first grand retreat. Our voluntary withdrawal from the Eurovision Song Contest for 2026.
Because apparently nothing says moral superpower. Quite like pulling out of an international song competition, almost 2 years in advance.
The official fact, delivered with all the somber gravitas Grovey could muster, is that they formally announced they will not participate. We're joining Spain, Ireland, the Netherlands, and Slovenia in this symbolic act.
It's a coalition of the, let's say, morally selective.
Well, this wasn't some sudden principled epiphany, was it?
Not at all. This decision was driven entirely by prolonged high-visibility public pressure. We're talking months and months of the Eurovision protests right outside the broadcasting house.
So RÚV had basically painted itself into a corner and had to be seen responding to the domestic noise.
Absolutely. And here's where it gets really interesting, because it shows the distinct lack of courage at the top. We need to look at the mechanism of the decision, which we've dubbed the bureaucratic cowardice.
Tell us about this bureaucratic sleight of hand.
Well, the board meeting on December 10th was supposed to be the venue for this big, decisive, ethical choice. But Stefan John Hafstein, the chairman of the board, later admitted to the press that it would have been Freinlegra.
Which means, what, cleaner? More straightforward.
Exactly. Cleaner to have held a direct vote by the full board of RÚV.
But they sidestepped that clean vote. Why?
Because the executive committee, the Framfamdagshorn, made the binding decision the day before the board meeting.
Oh, that is just classic.
It turned the official board session into nothing more than political theater. It was designed entirely to diffuse responsibility among a smaller, less publicly accountable group.
So if you're going to grandstand on international ethics, you should at least have the courage to put the decision to a clear, documented vote in the biggest forum you have.
But they didn't. Instead, it was an exercise in avoidance, all dressed up as ethics.
And we have to highlight the dissenters, the few voices of actual reason in all this moral posturing. We had Ingvar Smári Bergason, Unnur Bra Konradsdóttir, and Svein Oskar Sigurðsson, who all voted against the withdrawal.
And their core argument cuts right to the absurdity of the whole thing.
Which is?
RÚV is not a foreign policy institute. It's a national broadcaster. It's focused on culture, news, entertainment. When did singing contests suddenly become the main battleground for Iceland's geopolitical alignment?
It's just a cheap way to feel important internationally without actually sacrificing anything substantial.
Precisely. And that, of course, brings us to the famous hypocrisy hook.
Ah, yes. The contrast here is truly sublime in its staggering cynicism.
In the very same week that Iceland cancels its participation in a song contest, citing overwhelming moral distress, a conviction so profound it necessitates shutting down an avenue for cultural expression.
What else was happening?
The Icelandic Chinese Trade Council was actively planning a large-scale delegation to Beijing for spring 2026.
You could not write a better satire of the modern globalized conscience. It's unbelievable.
We're loudly asserting that we cannot, under any circumstances, share a cultural stage with Israel, but we will happily sell every single piece of cod, herring, and aluminum we can produce to Beijing.
So we draw a moral line at pop music, but the ledger books remain pristine and pragmatically silent.
It's the definition of selective morality. The conscience is strictly for show, deployed on a cultural stage where the economic risk is precisely zero. The fish trade, however, that's where the real profit is.
And when it comes to the national economy, we demonstrate a cynical, almost breathtaking pragmatism. The moral ledger is ridiculously unbalanced in favor of the GDP.
And let's not pretend we were pioneers here. Iceland was absolutely not the brave solo act charging into the wind, staking a claim for the global conscience.
No, we were the reluctant follower, weren't we?
Completely. We waited, we calculated, we observed until the Netherlands and Ireland had already definitively signaled their intent to withdraw.
Only when we confirmed we could join the mob. Only when we knew it was safe to throw a rock without risking a costly diplomatic or economic response did RÚV make its move.
We're followers, not leaders, in these ethical stands.
So what's the net result? We've politically alienated ourselves from this massive European cultural spectacle. And sure, we have the great quote from director Benedict Erlingsson about not wanting to be invited to a genocide party. A powerful line, to be sure.
It is, but the reality of the cultural void remains. What happens in May? This contest has defined our spring cultural calendar, our water cooler talk, our national obsession with performance and failure for decades.
I predict total cultural and psychological collapse. The political decision has been made, but the addiction remains. We will all be sitting at home, slightly ashamed, frantically pirating the foreign stream.
Because we can't quit our national obsession with the glitter, the camp, and most tellingly, the deep-seated self-loathing that comes with watching the entire spectacle and critiquing it.
We've taken the most visible, dramatic public stance possible, asserting our independence and morality, and yet the private temptation to consume the content we officially rejected will be overwhelming.
The Great Withdrawal here isn't from the contest itself. It's a withdrawal from any kind of collective, principled commitment. It's been replaced by fragmented, hypocritical consumption, a fascinating study in national cognitive dissonance.
Precisely. And if we're this incompetent at maintaining a moral stance, just wait until you hear how we handle our biological integrity. Let's move directly from the cultural withdrawal into the most invasive form of outsourcing imaginable, the industrialization of heredity.
This is truly a story that hits the primal societal nerve of the nation, overriding economics and politics entirely. The Kjeld genetic glitch, a perfect storm of globalization and, well, genetic bad luck.
Let's start with the facts because they are deeply disturbing. A specific Danish sperm donor, known officially as donor 7069, or more infamously now as Kjeld, carries the genetic mutation for neurofibromatosis, type 1, NF1.
And NF1 is not a minor ailment. It's a serious condition that causes tumors to grow unpredictably on nerve tissue. It can lead to developmental delays, bone deformities, and a host of other systemic issues.
And here's the core of the crisis. This single donor has fathered over 200 children across Europe.
Over 200, and that includes at least 4 confirmed cases right here in Iceland.
And the timeline is the most damning part of the puzzle. The sperm was donated around 2005. The defect wasn't clinically confirmed and flagged until 2023.
Which means this genetically flawed material was in wide, unrestricted circulation for, nearly 2 decades, used internationally, bypassing every single regulatory safeguard we all just assumed were in place.
And we need to put this into the proper Icelandic context. This is what makes this scandal so existential here. We are a nation of just 380,000 people, and we are intensely focused on genealogy.
We literally created the Icelandingabok app, that vast, sophisticated genealogical database, specifically to prevent accidental incest and to ensure we all know our kinship.
It's not just an app, it's a massive, multi-generational defense mechanism against exactly this kind of unknown kinship. We rely on knowing precisely who everyone is and how we're all related.
And this foreign import, this industrialized, commodified paternity, it just bypasses all of our sophisticated genealogical and societal defenses. It introduces an unknown, toxic genetic variable at an industrial scale.
It's a deep-seated societal phobia being realized. We outsource the fundamental, sacred process of creating our future generation, assuming that basic safety standards were being met.
And what we got was a ticking time bomb.
Former MP Jota Skúladóttir perfectly encapsulated the national shock. She called it waking up to a bad dream.
And the true horror isn't just the 4 confirmed cases of NF1, it's the potential for dozens more unknown half-siblings carrying this defect who have been created by a single faulty imported batch. The anxiety is just paralyzing.
We have to categorize this correctly. This cannot be framed as a simple medical oversight.
No, this is an industrial accident in the purest sense of the word.
I agree completely. This is biological colonialism. We trusted a foreign entity, the European Sperm Bank, to handle one of the most fundamental processes of human reproduction. We treated the source material like buying a mass-produced component for a manufacturing line.
We just assumed the Made in Denmark label implied some kind of quality control.
And now, the European Sperm Bank is behaving like a negligent manufacturer issuing a product recall, except the product is a human child, and you absolutely cannot recall a child.
This donor, Kjeld, is the biological equivalent of a faulty brake pad that we can't just swap out. The liability is astronomical, both medically and morally.
The national reaction, as always, is predictable. Digor B. Eggertsen, an MP who is also a practicing doctor, immediately called for new legislation to drastically limit the number of children one donor can father.
This is a textbook example of Retta Hatter in reverse. You know, that tendency to overregulate after the fact.
Right, we wait for the biological catastrophe, the massive failure of external systems we relied on, and then we scramble to write the law. We are inherently reactive, never proactive.
We assumed that EU standards would cover genetic QC, but they proved utterly inadequate when faced with industrial-scale paternity.
And the immediate, real-world ripple effect of this scandal is hitting an already buckling national system. You mentioned the emergency rooms earlier. Let's look at those numbers again. 86 patients crammed into 36 available spots. And that's just from the flu season hitting hard.
Now you overlay the Kjeld scandal onto that strain. The healthcare system, already at its breaking point, has to immediately prepare for a massive influx. We're talking about complex genetic consultations, NF1 screenings for potentially hundreds of children.
And inevitably, a wave of paternity lawsuits against the clinics that facilitated these imports.
The illusion that our health system is some kind of fortress, able to absorb and mitigate any global risk, is completely shattered. It's a sieve, passively filtering in biological and genetic risks that we never had to consider when we managed our own contained gene pool.
This imported tragedy is just another catastrophic line item on the national bill, exposing that our reliance on global commerce extends into the very essence of who we are. And sometimes those imports are tragically defective.
It's the ultimate lesson in trusting foreign industrial quality control with your own future. And the cost, emotionally and financially, is truly incalculable.
It's devastating. And speaking of systems collapsing under strain, let's transition from the biological withdrawal, the failure to protect our health, to the most shameful story of the week. The welfare withdrawal, the failure to protect our most vulnerable citizens.
The closure of the food bank. If any story should define the absolute moral crisis facing the country this week, it's this one. This story screams hypocrisy louder than any Eurovision boycott ever could.
Agreed. Let's start with the facts of the collapse. Astridor Jonaflosadottir, the chairperson of Kjeld Scandal, Iceland's Iceland Family Aid, made the heartbreaking announcement.
The organization, which has operated for 22 vital years, will cease operations entirely in March 2026. They're bankrupt.
And crucially, they're bankrupt, not because poverty has been solved, but because their most basic infrastructure has failed. They cited the final, fatal straw. Their critical box truck is written off, the cold storage at their headquarters in EU Fell is broken.
And their computer system is ancient. They couldn't even afford the minor basic maintenance required to keep food cold and deliver it to people who desperately need it.
This is the crux of the shame. This is not a failure of food supply. It is a failure of logistics and infrastructure maintenance in a country that claims to prioritize its social safety net.
They couldn't afford the equivalent of a few major service calls while operating in one of the wealthiest nations per capita on Earth. It's absurd.
And what are the families relying on them getting this Christmas? We have to detail the sheer indignity of the final Christmas aid. It is not a traditional holiday meal.
No. It's a pathetic, heartbreaking patchwork of corporate leftovers. Azure Yona had to specifically detail the donations. Soft drinks from Olgarin, various dairy products, and a shipment from Kaupfélag Skagfirðinga.
Let's really internalize that image. In Iceland, the bastion of the Nordic model, a country that sells itself as a beacon of social equality and high living standards, poor families and children are receiving a Christmas handout primarily consisting of soft drinks, courtesy of a corporate soda company.
Olgarin, a soda and beverage company, has become the de facto guarantor of Christmas dinner for our poor. It's not a functional welfare state, it is a dystopian patronage system.
The state has fully outsourced its most fundamental moral obligation to a sugar water manufacturer.
And this leads us to the prosperity paradox, the financial juxtaposition that should make every single taxpayer absolutely incandescent with rage. We have to contrast this destitution with the government's simultaneous, almost compulsive willingness to pour money into entirely mismanaged, self-serving projects.
Let's pull out the government receipts. Juxtaposition 1. While Kjeld Scandal is failing because they can't afford a new truck, the state is spending 3.2 billion ISK renovating the Brekkerborg preschool.
And that project, mind you, is not only still unfinished, but has been utterly mired in public scandals and mismanagement.
3.2 billion kroner for a single preschool renovation that can't even be completed on schedule.
Yeah.
And at the same time, billions more are being pumped into government office renovations.
So the bureaucrats responsible for this societal failure have polished state-of-the-art desks and high-end coffee machines. They can afford to give themselves the finest working environment imaginable, but they can't afford to keep the infrastructure of charity working.
But the real shocker is juxtaposition 2. The cost ratio that demonstrates a truly perverse set of priorities. We looked up the cost for the state to keep just one prisoner incarcerated. The number is staggering. 56,734 kroner every single day to house and feed one inmate.
Now compare that daily cost for a criminal to the inability of the entire state apparatus to find the funds necessary to keep a single crucial food truck running, delivering basic sustenance to hundreds of poor families. This is the most profound and damning indictment of the Nordic model imaginable. We are supposed to be the functional welfare state, the paragon of social democracy. We are, objectively, a wealthy nation.
But the essential charity sector is being starved into oblivion.
It proves a complete failure not just of funding, but of political and moral priority. We're a society that demonstrably values the abstract process of maintaining expensive, bureaucratic assets, the endless construction contracts, the asset management, the exorbitant cost of incarceration, more than the simple, fundamental act of ensuring human sustenance for our poorest citizens.
The Great Withdrawal here isn't just from welfare. It's a wholesale withdrawal from empathy itself. They made a conscious choice to prioritize renovation scandals in prisons over food for children. It's a tragedy wrapped in cynicism.
And this collapse is happening, fittingly, at the exact moment we need that social support the most, as this gloom descends across the nation.
And speaking of things collapsing, let's talk about the political withdrawal. Because when the systems start to buckle, the highly attuned politicians read the room. Or rather, they read the polls.
The rats are leaving the sinking ship.
This was the synchronized display of political fatigue and self-preservation. Svandís Svavarsdottir of the Left Greens and Sigurður Ingi Johannsson of the Progressive Party.
Both longtime pillars of the current, highly unpopular coalition announced they're stepping down as party leaders.
It's a massive defection. Svandís gave the usual vague reasons, a desire for change, personal renewal, all that. Sigurður Ingi then quickly followed suit, clearly wanting to avoid being the last one standing when the lights went out.
The timing is not accidental. It is critically revealing. The Left Greens, VG, are currently polling dangerously close to the 5% threshold.
The point where they could be completely wiped out of parliament, losing every single seat.
So we should not mistake this for a noble resignation of honor, should we?
Absolutely not. This is an evacuation. They are highly skilled political operators. They've read the internal polling. They see the iceberg of public opinion dead ahead, and they are pulling their personal political ripcords before the coalition plane hits the ground.
They're abandoning the catastrophic mess they created, the persistent inflation, the intractable housing crisis, the sheer crushing unpopularity of this government, and they're pulling out now.
Perfectly timing their departure to hand the bag of garbage to the next generation of political scapegoats. It is cynical, but strategically sound.
And the vacuum is immediate. The left wing is already fragmenting rapidly. We're seeing Sanna Magdalena Martudodir launching her new list, Vord til Venstre.
Spring to the left, she's attempting to cannibalize the dying Left Greens, which honestly is like competing for deck chairs on the Titanic.
As the old guard retreats, the internal fighting just accelerates, guaranteeing only one thing: sustained, debilitating chaos on the left side of the aisle.
And who, meanwhile, is watching this self-immolation from the relative calm of the political sidelines?
The Independence Party. They're polling strongly, holding around 30% support in Reykjavik, stable nationally. They don't even need to campaign aggressively.
No, the left is busy eating itself alive, guaranteeing right-wing dominance almost by default in the next election. Their opposition doesn't need to be effective, they just need to remain coherent and watch the other side implode.
And this political exhaustion feeds directly into the rigged financial system that keeps the average Icelander perpetually trapped, particularly when it comes to housing.
Let's connect the political withdrawal to the reality of the housing market game. We had two major financial pieces of news this week that, when you view them together, they just crush all hope for meaningful economic change. It's a perfect pincer movement against the average borrower.
First, we had the devastating Supreme Court ruling. The court ruled against the Consumers Association, Nintendesum Token, in a landmark case concerning Arion Bank's calculation of interest rates on indexed loans.
This is critical. The courts effectively shut the door on thousands of borrowers who are hoping for relief or recalculation on those punishing, historically high indexed loans. The judicial system, in a moment of great clarity, protected the bank.
So the little guy loses, the institutional lender wins, and the courts affirm the whole structure.
And simultaneously, in the face of this judicial protectionism for the banks, what does the government propose as its great housing solution to help first-time buyers?
They plan to pump 5.5 billion ISK into shared equity loans, the Hlutdeild Darlin.
This is essentially the government taking a partial stake in the property while subsidizing the buyer's initial outlay.
And crucially, who immediately warned against this strategy?
The central bank. The central bank played the role of the only adult in the room, stating clearly that injecting 5.5 billion ISK of demand-side capital into a supply-starved housing market is exactly the wrong thing to do.
Because it doesn't create a single new home. It only serves to inflate house prices further, immediately offsetting any perceived benefit to the first-time buyer. The system is rigged with an elegant cruelty.
It truly is. The courts protected the asset holders, preventing any relief on past interest, and the government's supposed help. These new loans only increases demand, making housing more expensive for absolutely everyone.
The Icelander is caught in a perfect vice, trapped between a greedy, judicially protected bank and an incompetent housing minister who is actively pouring gasoline onto the fire while claiming to be extinguishing it.
It's absolutely genius in its structural cruelty, a perfect synergy of political failure, institutional protectionism, and economic incompetence, guaranteeing perpetual unaffordability.
And as if the political and financial reality wasn't gloomy enough, the actual universe decided to intervene and, rub salt in the wound. Let's talk about the meteorological withdrawal.
Let's discuss the infrastructure, which we now know is held together by little more than optimism, duct tape, and diesel fumes. We just had a massive low-pressure system batter the country between December 11th and 13th.
We had property damage, yes, but more importantly, the storm exposed the structural, existential fragility of our high-tech, green energy self-image.
The fragile power grid is the key vulnerability. The storm delivered repeated, debilitating power outages across the Westfjords, Vestfjordur, and deep into East Iceland. Specifically, the crucial transmission lines, the Seyðisfjarðarlína and the Neskapsstærlína, failed due to icing and extreme winds.
And what happens when the lines fail in the land of 100% renewable energy, the supposed beacon for massive data centers that require total stability?
The towns run on backup generators. This is 2025. We are a nation that markets itself globally as the epitome of renewable, stable, green energy production.
Yet, the moment the wind blows too hard and the ice hits, entire towns are forced to revert to burning diesel oil in the fjords just to keep the lights and heat on.
Our green image is demonstrably for foreign export and international branding. The domestic reality is primitive. Essential services are held together by diesel fumes and wishful thinking.
It completely contradicts the narrative of a high-tech society that has transcended fossil fuels.
The storm proved our infrastructure is fundamentally unprepared for routine severe weather, let alone the increased frequency and intensity projected under climate change. The system is operating at the absolute limit of its capacity.
And every major weather event triggers a national emergency response, not just a cleanup.
And the minor absurdities always pop up during the worst storms, just to cement the sense of domestic chaos and lack of control.
Like trampolines, the ultimate symbol of suburban Icelandic life-taking flight in Grafarvogur, turning into high-velocity projectiles.
And the sheer parochial chaos. A truck hitting a bridge on Breiðholtsbraut, closing a major artery in the capital area. The chaos isn't just rural, it's domestic, embarrassing, and right on our doorsteps.
And that infrastructure failure leads directly to the gloomy forecast from the high priest of weather despair, the meteorologist Siggy Stormer. He has officially predicted the Red Christmas.
Meaning no snow. Just a sustained forecast of rain, sleet, and temperatures hovering just above freezing throughout the critical week of December 15th through the 21st.
The weather is withdrawing its cooperation entirely.
This is more than just a bad forecast. It's a profound psychological blow. We tolerate the bone-deep darkness of December in Iceland, precisely because we believe in the promise of the snow, the essential light, the reflection, the magic, the national image.
Without the snow, the darkness is absolute. It's wet, miserable, and heavy. It strips away the marketing and the nostalgia.
And it aligns perfectly with the gloomy political and economic news we've been discussing. The meteorological reality is the ultimate pathetic fallacy.
Iceland isn't a winter wonderland this year.
Yeah.
It's a wet, miserable rock with bad wiring, a collapsing infrastructure, and a broken social contract. The Red Christmas is the universe itself mourning the state of the nation.
We earned the slush.
We absolutely did. Okay, let's pivot away from the existential threats and move to the segment that proves we are still somehow fundamentally and gloriously absurd.
We need distractions.
And apparently we needed international validation for our ability to sit around in our bathing suits.
Ah, yes, cultural life, where the mundane meets the UNESCO registry, the ultimate victory for the average Icelander. The pools. Icelandic sunmenning, or swimming pool culture, has been officially inscribed on the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage List.
I mean, we have successfully convinced a branch of the United Nations that the act of sitting around gossiping in hot, highly chlorinated water, usually after a very brief swim, is a profound act of cultural heritage.
Worthy of standing on par with, say, traditional craftsmanship or ancient rituals globally, it validates our national obsession with the hot tub.
It's the ultimate validation of the collective daily routine. But I must agree with your prediction. With great cultural validation comes the great responsibility of enforcement. I foresee the immediate rise of the pool police.
Oh, absolutely. Failing to shower naked and meticulously with soap before entering is now no longer just a disgusting local habit. It is a direct violation of an international treaty signed in Paris.
You're not just being unsanitary, you are actively attacking our intangible cultural heritage, and the UN will hear about it.
And in sharp contrast to this sanitized UN-approved pool culture, we have the ongoing cultural fight over the Yule lads, the Yule Sfinar.
The debate is over whether our dirty, thieving, original Yule lads should be granted similar UNESCO status.
This is a genuine culture war in miniature, isn't it? The cultural elite, the mayor, the minister of culture, they desperately want to sanitize our grotesque, wonderful past. They want the friendly, cuddly, tourist-friendly versions of the lads.
The ones who leave tiny, pleasant gifts in your shoe.
But we need to fight for the status of the dirty lads. We must champion the original chaotic versions. We need to fight specifically for the recognition of Cat-Crocker,
The notorious meat hook thief who would literally use a hook to snatch meat from your rafters.
Precisely. The Yule lads were born from Grilla, a child-eating ogress. They're anarchic, window-peeping, sausage-stealing trolls. We should not be hiding them. We should be celebrating the absolute anarchy and grotesque humor of our original folklore, not polishing it up for some polite international committee.
Keep Cat-Crocker criminal. Keep the cultural menace alive. It's the only truly authentic piece of our past that hasn't been monetized or sterilized yet.
And speaking of things that perfectly capture the national mood, let's turn to the soundtrack of 2025. The band Lone has released their new, profoundly melancholic Christmas album, Pabi Kom du Heim? Kjeld.
Daddy, come home for Christmas. It's the perfect, miserable, Americana-infused soundtrack for this specific moment. We have a bankrupt food bank, a forecast of wet, gray weather, and utter political chaos.
This is not Jingle Bells cheer, it is winter depression with a slide guitar. It captures the deep-seated longing for a comfort and stability that simply isn't present this year.
And here's the final brilliant piece of cultural irony tying us back to the Eurovision withdrawal. We just loudly boycotted an international contest to assert our fierce, independent moral compass and geopolitical identity.
Yet one of our most cherished, beloved annual traditions is the English Christmas Songs concert, held annually at Satire.
And this tradition dates back conveniently to the WWII occupation. It's the ultimate colonial hangover.
We want to be fiercely independent, but culturally and musically, we remain an enthusiastic suburb of London. We want to sing songs brought to us by an occupying army in English, while simultaneously railing against international cooperation at Rouvi. The cognitive dissonance is astounding.
It is truly magnificent. And finally, let's wrap up our look at the state of the nation with sports, the arena where the national metaphor plays out in real time.
The handball psychodrama, the women's national team's roller coaster performance at the World Championship, is always a perfect encapsulation of the Icelandic psyche.
Moments of individual brilliance followed by completely inexplicable systemic failure. The coach talking about needing to lengthen the good chapters is the national goal writ small. We are always almost world class.
Always demonstrating the potential, but the execution and the sustaining power always fall apart in the final moments, guaranteeing we remain in the second tier.
And the small, cruel humiliations. We have to watch the 45-year-old Norwegian goalkeeper Katrine Lunde absolutely dominate the opposition with a humiliatingly high 57% save rate. It just rubs salt in the wound of our own inability to sustain collective excellence.
We look for external heroes even in our own sports narratives.
And this is exactly why the true national religion, above all this domestic psychodrama, remains utterly foreign.
The English Premier League. The headlines this week are dominated by analysis of Aston Villa versus Arsenal, our emotional investment, our true deep-seated passion in a match in Birmingham exceeds, sometimes wildly, our interest in local politics.
Or the fate of the left greens, or the closure of our own failing institutions. It is the ultimate escapism from the wet rock. We outsource our emotional investment to a functioning, competent foreign league.
And finally, even our individual heroes are succumbing to the overarching theme of injury and failure. Holmkrid Dora Fridtjosdottir, our top skier, suffered a serious injury while training in St. Moritz, immediately putting her Olympic dreams in jeopardy.
It fits the theme perfectly. Even our best and brightest, when they venture abroad seeking international greatness, are met with bad luck and systemic injury. The Great Withdrawal affects everyone, from the collective conscience to the individual Olympic dream.
That brings us to the close of this deeply, profoundly reassuring Monday broadcast.
We have completed our review of the entire landscape of failure this week, all under the banner of the Great Withdrawal. We watched our moral compass shatter on the rocks of the Chinese trade deal, proving that culture is cheap, but cod is not.
We discovered our profound genetic fragility thanks to industrial-scale Danish imports. We witnessed the welfare state collapse, replaced by corporate soft drinks for the poor at Christmas.
We watched the politicians time their perfectly cynical evacuation before the polling numbers hit zero, and the weather gods, in a final, spiteful act, gifted us the red Christmas.
We spent the last few decades pretending to be a moral superpower, a high-tech society, and a functioning welfare state. This week, the news proved we are just a wet gray rock with consistently bad wiring, a broken food bank, and a ticking genetic time bomb.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, as you navigate this profoundly disappointing Monday?
Here's the final provocative thought, building on all the outsourcing we've discussed. If Iceland keeps outsourcing its most critical national functions, from paternity through imported sperm to national defense to the feeding of our poor relying on soda companies, what fundamentally is left that actually defines the nation beyond hot water, diesel generators, and a deep-seated, abiding addiction to English football?
Something to mull over as you prepare for the wettest, grayest Christmas in recent memory. Perhaps you should just go take a bath. It is, after all, now an internationally recognized cultural heritage.
Your final, ironic call to action. Keep your heads down, ignore the absurdity of the market and the government, because ignorance truly is bliss. Definitely don't tell your friends about this show.
We don't need any more self-aware cynics on the streets. We'll be back next week to tell you precisely how much worse things got.
Join us then.
The voices in this podcast were generated by AI. However, all information, facts, claims, concepts, and the script itself were prepared, editorially reviewed, and are the original work of a human author.